Hi guys, my name's Chris Wright. I'm a landscape photographer working out of Granada, Spain. Now, this week I spent a lot of time down in the province of Cadiz checking out locations for a workshop that I'm going to run 2026, so keep an eye out for announcements regarding that as we move through the year. But the location I wanted to feature today is a kitesurfing beach near Tarifa. And the reason I want to focus on this location today, is that it has particular demands on photography, on photographers, in that what you're photographing is a chaos of fast-moving objects and fast-moving people. Kite surfers regularly occupy speeds between sort of 10 and 40 miles an hour, and it's chaotic, it's crisscrossing, it's very difficult to get a composition, it's very difficult to get sharp focus, and it's hard. Okay, so to give an idea, I shot for about an hour and a half down there, and 250 shots, and out of that there were 20 keepers, and the vast majority of the ones that were rejected were not because it was out of focus, but because there were people crossing the camera or unbalanced composition, because it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen in the next split second around the edges of the frame. So it's pray and spray, or spray and pray, as they say. So I wanted to talk about the camera that I used, I want to talk about the lens that I used, the settings that resulted in the photographs, and hopefully that will be helpful to anybody who's going out and shooting some fast-moving sporting activity where it's pretty critical to get sharp focus and really, you know, approach this with a bit of planning. Okay, so let's get stuck in. So what I needed to take on this shoot was I needed a means of compressing the distance, because I'm shooting things that are quite a way out to sea. It could be a couple of 100 yards off the beach. So a long distance lens, telephoto lens, is essential. I took my Canon 70 to 300mm lens. For that, it's one of Canon's sort of fastest focusing lenses in the EF range, and it's relatively light. It's not a big lens like the 400mm or the 500mm, and very good for this type of thing. I also chose to take the Canon R7 mirrorless, and the thinking behind this is twofold. One is that it's a cut frame sensor, crop frame sensor. So APS-C sensor, which gives you effectively a crop view of the world, which gives the impression of bringing distant objects closer to the lens. So it basically, if you multiply the focal length by 1.6, you'll be fairly close to the perceived focal length that you'd be working with. So it's the equivalent of about 450 mil paired with if I'm at the 300 mil end of that lens. So that gives me adequate reach. The other things that are great about the R7 is the autofocus system and the various elements around that focus system have been substantially upgraded since the days of the 7D. And really now it is a camera that is pretty much designed for sports. It is designed for precisely this job of locating and shooting fast-moving objects. A lot of bird photographers use it. And the thing that's particularly attractive about it, there's a good burst rate on it, I think 15 frames per second using the mechanical shutter. And it has an ability to follow focus. So if I use back button focus and set the camera up so that it follows the focus, I can depress the button on the back, catch focus on a surfer, and then move the camera to follow, obviously, that person in the frame, and it will automatically calculate and reset the focus. So if the person is moving in an unpredictable course, i.e. not straight across the plane of focus, but coming perhaps towards you, perhaps away from you, it will recalculate focus on the fly, so you're always going to get in focus shots. And I found that when I'd set this up correctly, I found that this actually produced about an 85% hit rate, including maintaining focus when you know, an object cuts in front of the thing that you're focusing on, which has often been a problem in the past. Now, there are a couple of things I did that were perhaps not straight out of the rule book, and I'd like to go into those a little bit. So I used spot focus, which is recommended for sports, but I used evaluative metering, and so the reasoning behind that is that the subject of the photograph, i.e. the surfers, were the darkest thing in the photographs without exception. They were wearing dark grey or black wetsuits. And I needed to have an exposure that I'm not familiar enough with the R7 to know that it's not going to blow out the highlights if I chose to evaluate my exposure on a black object. I know that I can always retrieve low lights, so to speak, from in post-production. Much easier to retrieve detail from shadows than it is from blown out highlights, and I wasn't 100% sure of where that red line is drawn, if you like, with the R7, whether I could you know, evaluate the black wetsuit and still have a well-exposed photograph, or whether that would blow out the highlights. And I think one of the issues that certainly that I came to in Spain, which is different to the UK, is you've got a much wider dynamic range in Spain. Your highlights are very high, and your shadows are very deep. And I really used to struggle to get you know, well-exposed shots, so I would rely on bracketing a lot of the time. Bracketing in this particular instance is simply not on the table. You can't do it because things are moving so fast, your subject's moving so fast, so you cannot bracket the shots. So I felt it more important to have an evenly exposed photograph that I could then play around with in post in order to bring out the shadows, and focus the eye on the area that I want the eye to look at. So that was the thinking there. I also decided to shoot in shutter speed priority. Now, the reason for this is it was a very bright day. I knew that the ISO, once set to 100, I would never need to raise the ISO. The last thing I want was more light getting into the lens. So really the dictating factor was always going to be either the shutter speed or the aperture in those terms. So what I felt was that I could safely leave the aperture to the camera to determine, because it's not important in these shots. As long as the subject is in focus, I don't really care about what's going on behind them. And in fact, if behind them is in crisp focus, that's, if anything, is going to detract from the shot, because it means your eye is going to be drawn away from the subject to something perhaps more colourful going on in the background. I didn't particularly want that, although that's something that I could deal with in post. So what I did was rely on shutter speed. A little bit of trial and error encouraged me to use 1/350th of a second. That seemed to be fast enough to freeze the action, whilst allowing for really fast moving objects to be slightly out of focus. So I think, you know, I could experiment again with that, but I think 1/100 would be too slow. I think there's a real risk where you've got objects moving at 40 miles an hour, a real risk of losing focus on those. So I wanted to play it safe and leave the camera in charge of the aperture, and that strategy worked well. Now, the hardest challenge really was composition. It was almost impossible to compose a really balanced frame, and so I had to really anticipate what was going to happen as best I could, and that required sort of some level of learning on the spot, because I had to sort of, if you like, anticipate the behaviour of all of the surfers in the frame. So some of the attempts came out well, others not so well. I cropped on the photographs, and here's a tip that is probably of interest. And I'm used to using 5DS, 50 megapixel sensor. So I'm used to being able to crop in a lot. Now, with the R7, that's not possible to the same extent. You very quickly reach a level where the picture begins to become ever so slightly pixelated. So you're effectively thinking about this. The sensor itself is smaller, so the number of pixels you've got covering the same area in the image. So to do this very simply, if you think the image is 6 inches across, and I shoot that with the 5DS with 50 megapixels, I'm going to have a lot of room within that 6 inches across to zoom in. If I'm shooting it with the R7, which is I think 32 megapixels, then that's quite a difference. So you're looking at just something over 2/3 of the size. So your ability to zoom in via cropping is going to be reduced, and I found this became an issue on a couple of pictures where I wanted to zoom in more. So that's one downside of using a camera like the R7, or using anything with an APS-C lens, in fact. So I think lessons learned. I was happy in the main with the shots, happy with the keeper rate. I didn't expect to get every shot nailed on. As I may have mentioned, I'm used to doing landscape photography where things move slowly, if at all, and creative choices around things like grass blowing in the wind and trees, foliage blowing in the wind are things that you can take your time over. In an environment like this beach in Tarifa, that's not possible. You've got split seconds to react, split seconds to make a frame, and you know, split seconds to really capture the image you want. So I think my thinking, you know, if I take a step back and look at this, I chose the right camera, I chose the right lens, so I'm very happy with those choices. I'm happy with the way that I set the camera up. The camera was set to turbo rather than one shot, so that I could get the focus tied in on a moving object whilst I was panning the camera. So that all worked fine, and that was great, because those are the issues that will really ruin your shoot. So very reliable from that perspective. I think if I had to do the shoot again, and I will be doing it again, I would choose to experiment a little bit more with shutter speed for dramatic effect, maybe get a little bit of movement blur into the pictures. But I think that's for experimentation. It's going to, you know, I would like to ideally spend a lot more time down there and shoot across the range of a whole day. It would be interesting to see what the prospects are on a sunset, given that the sunset will be out to sea, and if you're looking at these frames, it'll be out to sea and on the right-hand side of the frame. So that would be an interesting experiment. In doing this kind of a shoot and any kind of sporting shoot, the essential thing is to get your equipment set up and get the choice of lens correct. I think in this environment, on a sandy beach, choice of lens is really important, because changing the lens mid-shoot is an absolute non-starter. You've got sand blowing around in the wind, and sand gets everywhere. I found it on the outside of the lens, in the, you know, nestling in the nooks and crannies of the camera. It's very, very invasive, and I would absolutely not attempt to change a lens if on a beach, on a windy beach. You might get away with it on a very, very still beach. But that being said, all good. So I hope some of this has been useful, guys. If it has, do subscribe to the channel. That's the option down below. Give us a like, and there'll be more videos. We're doing camera craft and software, and there'll be another video next week, and hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks a lot.